Hi, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. Oh, the big green button. Okay. All right. Today I'm going to talk to you about strategic planning, and I'd like to keep this, well, those lights are bright. I'd like to keep this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to ask a few questions as we go along. First of all, why do we do strategic planning? Where you're going? Any other reasons? Reach goals. Say again? So you can measure it. Anybody else? Keep us on track. What? Focus? All good things. I would say the underlying reason to do strategic planning is to change. I mean, if you're comfortable with your business the way it is, you're moving along, you don't see any changes in the horizon in terms of your markets, your competition, there's no need to plan. But in most cases, the reason to plan is because you need to change. The business needs to grow. Okay, so strategic planning, and you heard I've done some strategic planning. There's no right way or wrong way to do strategic planning. Every practitioner does it the way they do it. The way I do planning now is quite different than what I was doing 10 years ago. And every plan you kind of pick up more experience and learn things as well as things you read along the way. So my way of doing it is the approach that I have. It's not the wrong way, it's not the right way, it's the way that I've seen that's been most successful for my clients. And when we talk about strategic planning, that's kind of the filling in the middle of the sandwich. Because if the goal is to change, you need to figure out where you want to go, what that change is going to look like, and that's what I call strategic thinking. So that's the process of figuring out where you want to go. Strategic planning is the process of writing the roadmap or creating that triptych that's going to show you how you're going to get there. And strategic execution is the actual fulfillment of that trip. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. So let's start with strategic thinking. Wikipedia says strategic thinking involves the generation and application of unique business insights and opportunities intended to create competitive advantage for a firm or organization. It's kind of a long-winded description. I would say it's really the process to develop a strategy. And that's really where strategic thinking comes into play. And I was fortunate enough to speak to several of the MLS CEOs or executives to find out how they do it. And a lot of them have the board members or shareholders involved in the entire process. I think this part of the process, the strategic thinking process, is really key to have those board members involved, because this is where we define where we're going. So let's start with strategic thinking. One thing you're going to hear a couple words coming out of my mouth repeatedly during this presentation. You'll probably get sick of it by the end. But they say repetition is the mother of learning, so I'm going to try and repeat the things that I think are most important. What you see there is a bell curve, normal distribution curve. It's really the definition of pretty much everything. And when I say focus, it's really important. I like that Peter Drucker quote there, there's nothing more wasteful than becoming highly efficient at doing the wrong thing. A lot of business owners don't focus necessarily on the right things when they're getting involved in strategy. And you can see we're focusing on the extremes of the distribution curve. And we look at it in a couple different ways. We'll talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses. We'll also talk about what you need to do in your business to really be successful. Now, in any business, there's a lot of activities you perform, but there's probably 2 or 3 at most that if you perform better than your competition, or 8 out of 10 compared to your competition, and you did everything else at 5 or about average, you'd be very successful. And part of the process is to figure out what those 2 or 3 things are. And it's pretty much industry driven. We'll talk a little bit about that, but say if you're a real estate developer, if you have ready access to cash and you have a competency at finding buildable land or well-located land, you could do pretty much everything else average, but if you do those 2 excellent, you'll be a strong business. So part of the process is to figure out what those things are. So the strategic thinking process really involves 3 steps. One is gathering information. And I'm going to talk about this later in the presentation. Somebody left their glasses up here, by the way. I may need them before this is out. Gathering information about your market, about your competition, about the various forces that impact your business. I know you guys don't face a lot of direct competition today, but I know that could change at any time. We were talking before this about how taxi drivers are now facing the change from some of the new generation of Uber and whatever the other one's called. So it could change. Obviously, there's certain businesses that are encroaching a little bit on your domain. But understanding what's going on is really the key step. And it's really important that, and when I do a strategic planning process, I give them a prescription of information I need before we get started. And usually the business owners can figure it out, but if they don't have access to the information, we often will hire someone to do some research on the competition, on the markets, because the more information you have going into it, the stronger your result will be. So once you have all that and you look at your business and what's going on in the market, then we formulate ideas as far as where we want to go. And this is where the whole strategic thinking process begins. And then the last part is creating choices or making trade-offs. What are we not going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do differently? And this is where the strategy comes into play. So that part is the strategic thinking process. And when I mentioned strategy a couple times, in the absence of competition, strategy isn't important. But as you get more competition, strategy is king, because strategy is the antidote to competition. Let that sink in a little bit. And that's why it becomes more important. So what is strategy? It's basically a set of choices. It's about what your business does. As far as we talk about value chain, does anyone know what I mean when I say value chain? It's the activities you perform. And whether you perform those same activities as everybody else, or you perform different activities, or you perform the same activities differently, those are things that differentiate you and allow you to take more profits or produce it at lower cost, or provide greater value and be able to sell your services for more. And that's what relative cost versus relative price. Do you see yourself as a low price or low cost producer or high cost producer? Do you charge a premium price or you a discount versus the competition? So all these things come into play. The whole goal of developing a strategy is to create strategic and sustainable advantage, so that what you do today isn't going to be leapfrogged by your competition the next week, and then you get into this zero-sum game where you're competing to be the best, which really isn't a good long-term strategy for improving profits. Because the whole idea of developing a strategy, and if you do have a good strategy, you'll find it in the bottom line, because your profits will be higher than the industry average. And then the last aspect of that is trade-offs. And trade-offs are most important. These are the things you're not going to do. Deciding what markets you're not going to serve, what services you're not going to offer. And this is really key, and many businesses I work with, those are the hardest decisions to make, because people don't want to turn things down. And so, but it's really liberating if you do it right. So let's start with the value proposition. This is defining which customers you're going to serve, which needs, as far as what the list of services you're going to provide, a list of products you're going to provide, and at what relative price. Are you the discount provider? Are you the high price provider, premium price provider? So this is a key decision, and this is part of what your strategy statement would say is what is your value proposition? The second piece is the tailored value chain. And this is really illuminating when we go through this process, because what we do is we start with and make a list of all the activities that business performs. And then we'll assign a relative cost, usually on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being it doesn't cost much to perform, 5 meaning it's very expensive to perform. And then we'll look at the value that each activity produces, and also do that on a 1 to 5. 1 produces low value, 5 it's high value. It really differentiates you. The clients really value that. And then we'll look at those activities, and we'll look at the things that are high cost and low value. Obviously, those need to change. Or the things that are low cost but really don't produce a lot of value, and those things may need to change. So that's part of tailoring your value chain. And then the last part is trade-offs. What are you not going to do? What markets aren't you going to serve? What products are you not going to offer? So that you can really focus in your business. There's that word again, focus. You're going to hear that time and time again. And I'm going to blow your mind when I tell you what my strategic plans look like, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so who has a written business strategy based on what I've described? One, two. Okay, good. You guys are honest. I like that. That's 2 more than I expected, so that's great. So I'm going to do a little strategy case study here. This is a client I work with back in Pittsburgh. Anybody else from Pittsburgh? One? Okay. Yeah, I was having breakfast with somebody today, and I was talking about the Pirates because he was from Atlanta, and the Pirates have beat up on Atlanta this week. He said, "You're only the second Pittsburgh Pirate fan I ever met here." I said, "I thought we were all Pirate fans." Anyway, so this was a client I was working with. They were a website and e-marketing company, and they were going along merrily. They're growing, but not really quickly, and they were providing websites ranging from maybe $3,000 to $25,000. And they were taking every deal that came down the road. They had basically a business model that for the smaller deals, the end result was a website that, batteries not included, some assembly required. It wasn't quite a turnkey website, but is what they could provide for the $3,000 one. But on the high end, they were really satisfying their customers. So they had a lot of small customers who were not satisfied and a bunch of big customers that were. And so we looked at their whole value chain, and we found out what the employees are good at doing, what the business was strong at, and we made some changes. We changed the value proposition to just focus on a very narrow market, a very high-end market, companies that had at least 25 employees, had a budget of at least $20,000, and we're going to just do bigger projects. We tailored the value chain so we're going to provide extra value in that marketplace. And we made the trade-off, no more small deals. That's really tough to get a salesperson to not chase those little deals that are just waving in front of you. But the discipline is paid off. The business is now more profitable, but most importantly, the customers and the employees are a lot more satisfied. So that's just an example of how a strategy can change a business in a very short time. So why do you do a strategic plan? Assume we now have a strategy. Why have a strategic plan? Well, the whole idea of a strategic plan is to then implement that strategy. As I mentioned before, it's the roadmap. It's how do we get from where we are today to where we want to be. It should guide decisions on a daily basis. How many people have a strategic plan, have developed a plan? How many have one? 1, 2, 3, a few out there. Okay, so many more have strategic plans. Okay, so the plan that you have should be affecting your decision-making on a daily basis. The other effect of having a strategic plan and going through the process is it should align the efforts of the organization. Now, this is where, when I was talking to some of the MLS groups, I got the impression that the execution team wasn't involved in the strategic planning team in many cases. And so, to me, that's a real disconnect, because the team that's going to be delivering this and doing the execution needs to be bought in, and usually the way to get them bought in is get them involved in the process. And I'm going to talk about the process a little more globally. But getting everybody aligned, getting everyone singing off the same song page makes a big difference. The other benefit of strategic planning is to gain a fresh perspective on the business. Characteristics of a successful plan. The execution team is involved in planning. There we go again. That's really important, and maybe that hasn't been the case in your organizations, but if you get the management team involved, you'll get a lot more buy-in, and you also get a much better plan. Biting off no more than the execution team can fill or can chew. I made this mistake really early when I was doing strategic planning. We used to come up with these grand and glorious plans, and the top managers would all have 4 or 5 strategic objectives in a quarter. That's way too many. And I've since learned you got to rein that in, and maybe 1 or 2 strategic objectives per person per quarter is the maximum you want to do, because everybody has operational responsibilities. So not biting off more than the team can chew. The plan must be focused and succinct. Of those of you who had a business plan, how many are more than 2 pages long, a strategic plan? Everybody? Okay. That's why I said I was going to blow your mind. When we do a strategic plan, 1 page defines the strategy, 1 page back and front or 2 pages is the whole strategic plan. It's focused. It's something you can look at every day, and it has all the accountability. We're going to talk about that. Accountability is built into the plan. Every item on the plan should have a set of initials associated with it, who's responsible for that achievement. And the objectives and goals are SMART. You've heard of the term SMART. We're going to talk about that as far as the definition of what SMART is. But here's a sort of a strange-looking pyramid that describes the process. And we start at the bottom of the pyramid, And as you can see, the three bottom things are strategic thinking, and really that can go into the fourth item as well. But this is where I thought that in an MLS world, this is where the shareholders and the board members would be involved. This is where you set the target and the goal for the business and the direction and the strategy where you're going. And as I said before, this is where a lot of homework is involved. So you need the market analysis, you need the competitive analysis, you need to know what you need to know about what's facing your business. And then we'll do a 5 forces analysis, which you might have heard of from a Michael Porter perspective, where we look at the different things that are impacting your business. Sometimes we'll do a SWOT, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threat. But the whole idea here is to get the whole picture and get all the information, all the data points we need to then figure out what's the best strategy. So that was that first part of the strategic thinking process. Another aspect that we filter into the mix when we're looking at strategy is purpose. Why does this business exist? We're going to talk about purpose in a minute, but it's the big why as far as why do you get up in the morning to come to this business? What is the guiding star that everybody's driving towards for your particular MLS? And that has to be part of this. And then from those data points, we develop this strategy. And then moving up the pyramid, the next thing is a long-term goal or a big, hairy, audacious goal. We'll talk about that. And that may be involved with the board as well. But once you get above that, then you're getting into developing the roadmap, and those are the action items as far as how you're going to get from where you are today, implement that strategy, affect the change in the business you need to change, and achieve what you're looking for. So let's talk about the elements of a strategic plan. We talked about strategy. We've beat that to death, so I'm not going to talk any more about that. Purpose, as I mentioned just a minute ago, that's the big why. And it's kind of a fun exercise to go through to develop the purpose of the business. I don't know if you guys have ever done that in your strategic planning process, but we go through a few different games that really help you think about your business and why you're there and why this business is important to come up with a purpose statement. As I said before, it's like a guiding star. It's something that you can never actually reach, but it's something that people are driving towards. I think some of the examples, was it McDonald's or somebody was happiness was an example of purpose. Usually it's a couple words. It falls short of save the world. Okay, so that's what purpose is. A big, hairy, audacious goal is sort of and this is interesting because when I first started doing this, our big, hairy, audacious goals were typically 10 to 15 years on the horizon. That has really changed a lot. We never go more than 5 years now because the rate of change has increased so much. People have a hard time wrapping their heads around looking out 5 years. But we do. We typically look out 5 years, and we develop a goal that is going to motivate change in the business. It's something that's 50 to 70% chance of reaching it, but it's going to create change. It can outlive the person who sets the goal. Probably the most famous, big, hairy, audacious goal that was ever set was the one set by John Kennedy at his inauguration, where he said, before the end of the decade, we're going to take a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. What was about that? It was very simple. Everybody could wrap their head around it. It outlasted the person who set the goal, and it created an entire change in the entire country. That's what a big, hairy, audacious goal has, and it's very motivating if you set one right, and it's really important that you do. Key success factors, I mentioned that when we were looking at the normal distribution curve. This is an interesting exercise to find out what are the 2 or 3 things that your business needs to do well to be successful, where you want to be in that 8 to 10 range, and you could be in a 5 range for everything else, and your business will be successful. I can't tell you how many times we've done this where either 1 or 2 of those items, they were still in the 5 range, even though they've identified those are successful. So those create targets in your planning process that obviously you need to improve those. So it's an important thing to discover. The brand promise are the 3 ways you matter most to your clients, yet differentiates you from your competition. This is really key, and this should be part of all your marketing messages. This is the subject of your elevator pitch if you're talking to somebody and you want to create an impression with them as far as what your business is all about. So it's important to discover these and also to discover whether you're truly living up to the brand promise. Sandbox. This is your target market. When we did the case study about Blue Archer, we changed their sandbox. Their sandbox was this big, wide open area. We took the sandbox down to a certain size customer in a certain geography, a certain offer, and that was where we wanted to dominate. And again, this is all about focus. No business has unlimited resources that you can be everything to everybody all the time and spend all your marketing dollars trying to reach the whole world. So the whole idea here is you create a sandbox that you want to dominate, and you put the majority of your marketing efforts into that market, so you can truly dominate that and be superior. Just a quick example. Prior to being a consultant, I was CEO of a systems integration company and consulting and software company. And our sandbox was very narrow. We focused on wireless communication, and we only sold our services to wireless communication, PCS carriers and things like that. We could have sold others, but we really narrowed our down. But what that did was we got to be so specialized and so focused, and we knew there was a good market there, and we knew more about that industry than our clients did. So we were able to charge much greater value or much higher prices for our services. So the whole idea is when you create a sandbox and you really focus, you create more opportunities to create profits. Critical numbers. We'll talk about accountability throughout this presentation, but it's really important that you're measuring on a regular basis what's going on as far as achieving this plan. I mentioned the analogy was a triptych as far as what the strategic plan is. Well, the measurements are these signposts along the way to make sure you're truly on course. And critical numbers may be focused entirely on your brand promise. Are we truly living up to this brand promise, or is it just kind of a joke? I mean, you want to make sure that when you're putting these messages out, that you're actually living up to them. And last, accountable objectives. When we do a strategic plan, we do objectives based on 3 years out, and they could be, depending on your business, it might be P&L type of objectives like revenue and profits. Could be balance sheet objectives like cash flow. It could be sales to a particular client. It could be different types of sales. It really depends on what your business is and where you're trying to change. But you want to have measurable objectives that are tracking either at the 3-year level, then at the 1-year level, and then at the 90-day level. Okay, why use an external facilitator? This isn't just a commercial for me because I'm not selling my services, but and it's really important to have somebody who's going to guide you through this process, to keep you on track, keep it from becoming a staff meeting, and again, as I've said the word focus how many times so far, but keep the group focused on just the important things and not spend a lot of time. Usually we can get a strategic plan done in about 16 hours as long as everybody stays focused. And that's really key. Also to get a source of new insights. Whoever you hire, hopefully they know something about the industry or something about the business you're serving, and they could bring some other thoughts to the process. Okay, so I already asked who has a written plan. I think about half of you did. How many have looked at the plan in the last month? Wow, good. Was that because you were coming here, or do you look at them every month? Good. Well, that's good. I can't tell you how many times I've gone. In fact, I just started a plan with a company that they make water sprinkler control systems. And we just started doing the plan, and I said, have you ever done this before? Oh, yeah, we got a plan. I said, well, where is it? And it's up on the top shelf. It was in a 3-ring binder. It had a nice coat of dust on it. And that's not uncommon. I mean, the planning process isn't an end in itself. I mean, it's an interesting process, and it's fun to go through, and you feel like you've accomplished anything, but really, when you finish the plan, you haven't accomplished anything. I hate to say that. The execution is where the rubber meets the road. But we'll be talking, speaking of execution, I love this picture. I love old train pictures. And this is a great quote from Winston Churchill. However beautiful a strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. Again, the planning process is really fun, it's interesting, and it does create some interesting conversation, but it's all about execution. And unless you're executing that plan, I'd say you're not getting much value out of the process up to that point. How many have a system to track strategic plan execution? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's what I thought. Actually, you're a little lower than what McKinsey says. They surveyed 800 executives, and only 45% failed to track execution. So 55% were tracking it. Not necessarily tracking it well, but tracking it. I'm going to talk to you about how we track execution, and it may seem a little rigorous, but it's really important. And as I said before, if you're not doing this, you're not tracking execution, you're really not getting the value. So causes of strategic plan failure, or causes of that train wreck. Lack of commitment at the top. Now, this isn't commitment to build the plan. Obviously, you all had that commitment, or the plan wouldn't have been built. It's commitment of executing. I can't tell you maybe I have all the ADD CEOs in my portfolio, and there are a lot of them, but this is something that we always have to deal with, is because the CEO and the executive team need to be the leaders in the execution of the strategic plan. And so that's what I mean commitment. I mean, you need to be committed to achieving the objectives that you have been assigned to or that you've picked for yourself. A lack of accountability or tracking system. Again, this is all about measurement. You know, the old adage, what gets measured gets done, and that's very true. Wishy-washy objectives, and I looked at some objectives that I saw from some of the MLSs I talked to, and I did see some wishy-washy objectives. And these are things where if you read it, you couldn't tell whether it was done or not, because there was no clear indicator of what done looks like. Okay, and that's really key. And then operational demands starve strategic execution bandwidth. This is really kind of two messages here. One is biting off more than you can chew as far as being too ambitious, but it's also accepting failure. And if someone says, you know, I wanted to get it done, but I had to roll out the new MLS software, or this, or basically the dog ate my homework, something like that. If you accept that, that's what I'm talking about here. You've got to not accept that. And that kind of leads into this. To achieve a strategic plan, you have to make sure change is welcome. Because what I said in the start of this presentation was the reason for doing a strategic plan is change. And if you're not interested in changing, save yourself the money and time and don't do a strategic plan. Just continue doing what you want to do a budget every year, and just go on your merry way. But if you are serious about changing, that's when you want to do a strategic plan. And the question is, are you the only one who's serious about it, or is your team serious about it? Because everybody's got to be bought into it, and that's part of the process of doing the planning process. And that's why you want the execution team involved in the planning process, because everybody's got to get behind this change. And there should be a big change involved in the process. Is failure acceptable? And I can't tell you how many times I've seen failure be acceptable in companies. And it's maddening. I knock my head against the wall until I have to grab the CEO by the collar and shake him a few times until they start to get it. Sometimes they never get it. I mean, I'm no miracle worker, but sometimes they never get it, and then it's time to move on. Do your people have the right skills? I mean, you come up with a lot of ambitious objectives, and you assign them to people. The question is, are they being assigned to the right people? And that's really key. You want to make sure they can be done in the time frame. And is your management team aligned? And again, we talked about this, getting everybody on board. So some of the keys, and some of this might seem repetitive, but I want to kind of get these messages clear. Because again, as I said before, repetition is the mother of learning. You got to have that buy-in from the team. You got to lead by example. That's mean all of you folks here, who, as leaders of your organizations, if you don't get your objectives done, don't expect anyone else to get them done. Clear accountability. As I said before, when we do a plan, everything is there's a set of initials, just one set of initials next to every item, whether it be an action item, whether it be a metric. There's one person accountable for everything on that sheet. Measure early and often. And I'm probably going to startle you when I tell you how frequently you need to measure this. We're going to talk about that in a second. Bite off what the organization can chew. Anyway, I don't want to beat that dead horse. Anyway, SMART objectives. We talked about this a little while ago. This is my favorite definition. You can look up SMART and you can see different words to go with the different initials, but this is what I like. Specific in that, you know, this is a specific target we're looking to do. Measurable. We want it to be black and white. No wishy-washiness at all. It's clearly that this was achieved or it's not achieved. No states in between. Assignable, you want to make sure you get it to the right person who can get the job done, and it's not going to be a stretch, and they have the bandwidth to do it. Realistic, that can be achieved by those resources in the time, and then it's time-related. And every one of our objectives are 90 days long or less. We never go more than 90 days. If you have a grand and glorious thing that's going to take 2 years, chunk it down into 90-day bites, and those are the objectives. Because at least the way I do it, everything's looked at in a 90-day window. Let's talk about a good objective and a bad objective. So these are SMART objectives. A bad objective, and I pulled this off somebody's website, so not the objective, but just the idea of a fusion training. So create courses for MLS subscribers. Anyone? Why is that a bad objective? Anybody? Wishy-washy. Yeah, it's vague. Who knows? You know. Yeah, I did. Okay, well, show me. So the good objective, taking that same one, of course, assigning it to somebody, is create the Fusion training course and deliver it initial realtor training by 9:30. So assuming this was 7/1, the start of the quarter, we're going to get this done. Okay? Now, how often do you measure this? These objectives, I'd say, you measure weekly. So that's going to, how are we going to do that? We'll talk about that in a minute. But in addition to the measurements of the objectives, there's also going to be critical measurements or critical numbers involved in the plan, depending on what quarter and what we're trying to achieve. Some might be daily. Maybe in your business it's not daily, but typically weekly and monthly and quarterly objectives have to be baked into the plan. But as I said before, 90 days is the longest we do an objective. And if you have a big objective, you chunk it down into 90-day bites, and that's what you focus on. So back to that old objective that I just showed you before, to create a Fusion training course and deliver initial realtor training. How do you do that in 90 days? How do you measure that on a weekly basis? Well, everybody who has an objective gets a sheet. And normally what you do is that column date due has all the Fridays in that quarter. All right, there's, 13 Fridays in a quarter? They don't have to have something on every Friday, but you want to have them measured on Friday dates. And then they put the milestones as far as the steps that are involved to make sure that objective is achieved. So why do you do this? I mean, if you just kept it as a 90-day objective, you don't look at it for 90 days, what often happens? Surprise, it's not done. Scheduled for the next quarter. Okay, it doesn't give you any opportunity to react, to change course correction, to give that person who's struggling help and get that and keep it on track. And if you do it that way, then you tend to not achieve objectives. Doing it like this, where you have milestones along the way, or these are the signposts along that roadmap that says, yeah, we are making progress and we're getting it done, then you can make corrections along the way. And how do you do that? You do that in the weekly accountability meeting. And now, I'm not saying you go this route, but this is one way to do it. I have clients that do this on a daily basis. Anybody do a huddle, a daily huddle, 10-minute huddle? This is another concept. Basically, it's a stand-up 10-minute meeting, and once a week in the huddle, they talk about their quarterly objectives or the milestones that are due. But here, this is more of a weekly. I figured if you aren't into the daily huddle approach, and the flexibility is pretty large as far as what the agenda for this meeting should be. But it's important to set an agenda based on the flow of your business and then stick with it. And it's really important to stick with the amount of time. You don't want these meetings to be long because people would dread them. You want them to start on time and end on time. But a couple of the items that might be in here is the weekly metrics. This is where you go around the room. Everyone says, this is my milestone that was due this week. Here's the results. This is my milestone that's going to be due next week. I'll talk to you about it next week. Bing, bing, bing. Just real quick. If they don't have a milestone due that week, they may have a milestone or a metric tied to the strategic plan that has their name on it, and they would report on that. And then once a week, one of the people in the group who has an objective would do a more formal presentation on the progress report on that objective. And they might be able to solicit input from the group as far as where they're struggling, where they need help, anything like that. So you got an update. And what's important about this is it keeps all this stuff top of mind. It shows this isn't management lip service and we're going to do this plan, and, well, we'll look at it a year from now. This is an important aspect because it's important for our business to change. And again, if it's not important for the business to change, don't waste your time doing strategic planning. So assuming you are, it's assuming it is important that the business change, put the effort into making sure you execute it. Okay. Oh, we got 10 minutes left. So summary and lessons learned. Pre-planning preparation is key. And I can't say this enough because I was guilty of this when I first started doing this, is we would go into these planning sessions without doing the homework. And then I realized that as my process improved and through experience, that you get a lot more value out of this if you really have a lot of data in front of you and understand your markets, understand your competition, understand what's going on in your business, what's going on in the external world, what's going on politically, what's going on socially. All these things impact your decisions as to how you form your strategy. So that's why when I go into this, when I give someone a proposal for strategic planning, they have about a 4-page survey of information I'm looking for. It's kind of custom to that particular business. And we don't get started until they fill it out. And sometimes if they can't come up with the answers, we'll hire a third party to do some research, because we got to have that information. to get this thing done. The right people must be present. Now, we've talked about this a few times, and the right people for the strategic thinking process where you're developing the strategy are probably not the same right people for the strategic planning process where you're developing the roadmap based on that target. Okay, again, just from my little knowledge of your organizations, it sounds like the strategic thinking process where you formulate that strategy is where the board members or the association members or the directors are involved and the CEO, and then taking it to the next step where you're building that roadmap or the plan, that's where you bring in the team who's going to execute it. Use a facilitator. Again, somebody's got to keep you on focus. And if you have a strong leader who can do it, then that's fine. But there should be a process involved so you make sure that when you start here, you come out there and you have a predictable outcome and that they're going to keep you on track, and this isn't going to be a 2-month process. This is going to be 16 hours of concerted effort, and we're going to get it done. Accountability at every step. Anyone know how many times I've said accountability today or focus? Those are the keys to this whole thing. Without this, you're wasting your time. And accountability at every step, every objective, every metric should have a name associated with it. But the important thing is not just having that name, but it's to follow up and having those people report on these weekly. Management commitment, lead by example. When we do a plan, especially with a new client, because ideally, in a perfect world, and I've seen this work, and it's really amazing when you get it going, when you develop this strategic plan and you have this high-level set of objectives that you want to accomplish for the year, okay? And then you chunk it down into quarterly objectives, and maybe have 4 or 5 objectives for the quarter. Those objectives, in turn, may lead to other objectives that are outside of the management team. I know some of your organizations may be small, maybe 5 or 6 people, but some might be large, 15, 20, 30 people or more. When you get everybody in the organization involved to have one strategic objective each quarter, you see this amazing transformation where the company starts moving ahead in 90-day clumps. And it's measurable and it's palatable, you can feel it. But before you do that and start moving those objectives down to the rank and file, so to speak, you got to make sure the management team can execute their objectives. So usually what we want to do is for the first quarter, or maybe if they don't get it right for the first 2 quarters, we're going to make sure they just stay within the management team or the team that did the plan and make sure they execute. Because ideally what we do is we'll have a system where it's visible to everybody, where you can see, okay, this person had these objectives, this group is accomplishing 87% of their milestones and 92% of their objectives, and whatever. We want to make sure that your name is up there at 100%, right? Because you're leading by example. So that's what I'm talking about. And last, you got to have a system. I talked a little bit about that spreadsheet just a minute ago. There's many different ways you can go about tracking this, but it's important that you do track it. Whatever way works for you, whatever you're most comfortable with, but chunk everything down to a weekly basis, track it on a weekly basis, show that it's really important, that the business needs to change, that you're behind it, and great things will happen. That's it. And I got 6 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Or if not, we can take a longer break. Questions?
Hello, Terry Tolman from the Realtors Association of Maui. I'll give you a hint. The reason why so many people raise their hands about having looked at their strategic plan is the National Association has made a new requirement that strategic plans are actually working. So we're quite getting familiar with them again.
Good.
And in our process locally, we came into the question of, okay, you got a strategic plan you're working on now, but you're working with a budget that was crafted 6 months, a year and a half ago. How can we switch the process so that the budget and the strategic plan mesh? Because you have all the goals in the world without the resources allocated to do it. You know, they can wish for all they want.
Right. Well, are you doing your planning once a year? Or I heard some people doing it every couple of years or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to get closer. It's going to be shorter time.
That was something, and I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't mention it. Normally what we do is we do a plan once a year, but we update it every quarter. And there's usually a 4 or 5 hour session once a quarter that looks where we are, where we've come from, what's changed, and we're constantly tweaking, and usually we set the next quarter's objectives at that meeting. So it's a constant process. So where you put the budgeting in that doesn't really matter because you're pretty much always up to date. If you accept that kind of process, where planning isn't a once every 2-year event. It's every quarter. You know, you do it once and you get it done, and maybe once a year you spend a couple days at it, but every quarter you're keeping it going. Okay, so then your budget just flows into that.
Hey, Matt Cohen with Clarity Consulting. Now, many of my clients are really good at the accountability and tracking with their strategic plans, but there are some strategic goals that are much more difficult to deal with in that way. Specifically, one of the hardest ones is what we call regionalization or MLS cooperation, where it's not entirely within the control of the organization doing the planning how successful they're going to be, because it depends on how their neighbor interacts with them. Their neighbor may not want to merge or cooperate in various ways. So that stymies accountability sometimes. The question is, what do you do in terms of accountability and tracking other than the micro activities of engagement? How do you deal with accountability and tracking when the organization doesn't entirely control the outcome?
Yeah, well, I think you need to narrow those objectives down to things that you can control. Obviously, you may have in your big, hairy, audacious goal, one thing I didn't talk about is when we describe where we're going, we put a vivid description, and that's really important in that everybody's bought into that picture of where we're going to be 5 years from now. Maybe that has that change in the relationship with your sister MLSs, but the things that you can control have to be in your objectives, and that's all you can do.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the micro objectives of engagement.
Yeah, it's just what you can control. You can't affect the weather. I mean, it's just what you can control.
It's cool.
All right. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.